You boil the water, you drop in the bag, you wait, half awake, staring at the steam before you're willing to speak to another human being. Some part of you feels almost embarrassed about that, like you shouldn't need a hot leaf water ritual just to become a functioning person, like a small daily dependency you'd rather not examine too closely. Here's the strange part. There was no first advertisement for this. No first recipe book. No ancient person holding up a cup and announcing the invention. Discovery like this doesn't usually happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in hundreds of tiny, forgotten experiments. A leaf tasted here. A bitter drink remembered. After a fever there, until a habit outlives the person who found it. And yet right now, at this exact moment, somewhere between 3 and 5 billion cups of tea are being poured around the planet, more than any drink on Earth except water itself. That gap between just a drink and the second most consumed liquid in human history doesn't happen by accident. Somebody, somewhere, was the very first person to drop a leaf into hot water and decide it was worth doing again the next morning. By the end of this, you'll know the legend that starts with a poisoned emperor, the household chore list that accidentally became the oldest written proof tea existed, the 2,000-year-old grave where scientists found the actual leaves still sitting inside, and the trade route where this plant became valuable enough to buy a warhorse with. The legend starts with Shen Nong, the mythical divine farmer credited with teaching ancient China both agriculture and medicine. According to the story, he spent his life personally tasting hundreds of wild plants, one at a time, to catalog which ones healed and which ones killed. The legend puts this around 2737 BCE, nearly 4,700 years ago. One day, the tale goes, he ingested something poisonous, and before it could kill him, a leaf drifted into his cup of hot water and saved his life on the spot. Here's what's fascinating. The text this story comes from, Shen Nong's classic of Materia Medica, was written down more than 2,000 years after Shen Nong supposedly lived. It's a myth later scholars used to explain an origin nobody could actually date. People wanted tea to have one clean beginning, one first cup, one moment. Human beings love beginnings like that. Reality, as usual, is messier. Long before anyone bottled that myth into a text, there was the plant itself. Camellia sinensis is an evergreen shrub native to the forested hills of East and Southeast Asia, and its leaves contain caffeine usually somewhere between 20 and 70 milligrams per cup, depending on the leaf and how long it steeps, roughly a third. Two-thirds of what you'd get from coffee. Your ancestors didn't need to understand any of that chemistry. They only needed to notice the result. You eat the leaf, you feel different. You boil the leaf, you feel different again. You remember it, and you do it tomorrow. There's a real physical clue that this went from accident to habit early. An ancient Chinese farming almanac called the Xiaxiaozheng, probably written during the Warring States period, centuries before anyone thought to write the Shen Nong legend down, contains what looks like the earliest known mention of tea being planted on purpose rather than simply gathered wild. It's one line in a list of farming chores, easy to miss, but it means someone had already stopped waiting for tea to show up and started growing it instead. So what's the oldest proof that isn't a legend or a farming note? That comes from a document nobody intended as tea history at all. In 59 BC, a minor court poet named Wang Bao from Sichuan province got into an argument with a household servant named Bian Liao, who kept refusing to run errands he felt weren't part of his job. Irritated, Wang Bao sat down and wrote an exhaustively detailed contract, listing every chore the young man now owed him. Buried in that list, almost as an afterthought, are two specific lines: buy tea at Wyang and boil the tea and prepare the utensils. Wang Bao wasn't trying to document anything for history. He was venting, in writing, at a servant who annoyed him. But that contract, written roughly 2,080 years ago, is the oldest surviving text that proves tea wasn't just a myth or an occasional medicine anymore. It was routine enough to argue about, ordinary enough to assign to someone you were furious with, right alongside fetching wine and sweeping the yard. Even a contract only proves people were talking about tea, though. It doesn't prove anyone can hold the actual leaves in their hand today. For that, you need something that survived underground, sealed away from air and rot for 2,000 years. In 2016, researchers analyzing plant residue from the Han Yangling mausoleum, the tomb of Emperor Jing of Han, who died in 141 BCE, ran the material through microscopic comparison against modern tea buds and confirmed it. Real tea, roughly 2,150 years old at the time, the oldest physical tea ever found, according to Guinness World Records. It had likely been sealed into the tomb as a luxury good for the emperor's afterlife. Here's the part nobody talks about. The record didn't hold. 5 years later, archaeologists studying a tomb from the Warring States period, in what's now Shandong province, identified charred tea residue in a drinking cup dated to between 453 and 410 BCE, nearly 2,400 years old, 3 full centuries older than the emperor's tea. That same 2016 study also found tea residue in a cemetery high on the Tibetan plateau, more than 1,000 miles from the emperor's tomb. dated to roughly 1800 years ago, proof that someone had already carried these leaves across mountains before most of the world had heard of the plant at all. The record keeps getting broken, which means the actual first cup was almost certainly earlier than anything anyone has found yet, in a moment now completely lost to time. Knowing when tea started doesn't explain how it stopped being just a drink and became something closer to a philosophy. That shift has a name. Lu Yu, an orphan raised by a Buddhist monk in Hubei province, who refused to take his vows, ran away, and reportedly spent time as a circus clown before a local governor discovered him at 14 and gave him an education. Around 760 CE, Lu Yu finished the Cha Jing, the classic of tea, 3 scrolls, 10 chapters, roughly 7,000 characters. The first work in the world devoted entirely to tea as an art form rather than a chore or a medicine. Tea sellers were so devoted to him afterward that they cast pottery statues of his likeness and worshipped him in their shops as a household god. But here's what's fascinating. Tea didn't spread by everyone copying his one method. As it traveled, people kept changing it. In Japan, it became a formal, powdered practice, whisked into froth rather than boiled. In Tibet, it was mixed with yak butter and salt for warmth and calories at altitudes where almost nothing else would grow. One plant, carried outward from Lu Yu's careful instructions, kept turning into something locally unrecognizable. That spread wasn't just cultural. It became an economy, and eventually something close to a weapon. By the Tang dynasty, China needed something Tibet had in abundance. Sturdy horses for its army, especially after years of internal rebellion had drained the empire's own supply. Tibet, in turn, had developed a real dependence on tea, both for the calories and warmth it provided at an altitude where growing crops was nearly impossible, and because Buddhist monks relied on it to stay alert through long stretches of meditation. The two needs lined up perfectly. Chinese officials began trading tea directly for Tibetan horses along what became known as the tea horse road, and by 1074 CE the Song dynasty had formalized the exchange rate through a dedicated government office, roughly 130 pounds of tea for a single horse. Porters carried compressed tea bricks up mountain routes toward the Tibetan plateau through terrain high enough that breathing itself became difficult. On journeys that could take months at a time. By the 13th century, China was trading millions of pounds of tea for around 25,000 horses a year. A shrub that started out as one man's private list of poisons and antidotes had become something two empires organized their military supply chains around. So what changed the relationship between humans and tea forever? The answer is simpler than you'd think. A mistake, sitting on top of a much bigger shift. Industrial production had already been making tea cheaper and faster for decades, letting millions more people afford it. Then, as the story is usually told, around 1908 a New York tea importer named Thomas Sullivan started mailing tea samples to customers in small silk pouches to save on packaging. He expected them to open the bags and brew the leaves loose, the way people had for nearly 2,000 years. His customers didn't bother. They dropped the whole pouch into hot water, decided that was easier, and started ordering more of exactly that. It's worth admitting. The story is tidier than the full history. A similar fabric tea leaf holder had actually been patented half a decade earlier by two women in Milwaukee, but Sullivan is the one credit stuck to. We tend to call what happened next progress. But here's what we lost along the way. Nearly 2,000 years of grinding, whisking, and waiting, quietly replaced by something you can dunk one-handed while checking your phone. So here's what actually happened, in order. A legendary emperor tasted a leaf that may never have existed at all, and got remembered for it anyway. A farming almanac quietly recorded the moment tea stopped being wild. An annoyed poet complained about a servant's chores and accidentally dated the drink for historians. A tomb kept a real cup of it intact long enough to identify 24 centuries later, and it's already been out-aged once. An orphaned clown turned scholar spent his life turning it into philosophy and got worshipped as a god for the effort. Empires traded it for the horses that decided wars, and a New York importer's packaging shortcut turned all of that history into something you can finish in under a minute. Maybe you've done something slightly embarrassing with a cup of tea, stood in the kitchen too long, reheated the same mug twice, stared out a window holding it, telling yourself you should be working, studying, answering messages, doing something useful instead. But that pause was never the wasted part across 4,000 years. The drink kept changing shape, legend, chore, luxury, good, philosophy, currency, habit, but the pause underneath it survived every single version intact. You're not addicted to a leaf. You're taking part in the same small, deliberate pause someone else decided was worth repeating, long before you were born, passed down through emperors and poets and monks and importers who never met each other and never will, and that nobody in all that time has ever quite managed to fully rush.